Here's the most uncomfortable fact about 1970s television. Some of the most heavily promoted, best-positioned, and talent-stacked sitcoms collapsed faster than the obscure throwaway filler shows networks barely cared about. In the decade that gave us All in the Family, MASH, and The Mary Tyler Moore Show, executives also greenlit projects they were convinced would dominate prime time, only to watch audiences reject them almost instantly. These weren't quiet failures. These were public embarrassments. Big concepts, familiar brands, heavy marketing, and brutal cancellations. We're counting them down from most anticipated to least, starting with the flops that promised the most and delivered the least. It sounds almost impossible now, but WKRP in Cincinnati was never meant to struggle. When CBS greenlit the series, they believed they were launching the definitive youth comedy of the late 70s. Radio was still culturally powerful. Music was changing. DJs were becoming counterculture figures. The concept looked perfect on paper. A failing AM radio station hires a young rock-focused program director who tries to drag it into the modern era. Executives expected a hit that would capture younger viewers the way All in the Family had captured older ones. Instead, the show barely survived its first seasons. The first problem was placement. WKRP premiered in a brutal time slot against established hits. Viewers never had a chance to discover it naturally. Ratings were weak from the start, and advertisers were unimpressed. For CBS nearly canceled the show outright after its first season. Internally, it was already being discussed as a mistake. This shocked the creators because the scripts were sharp, the characters were distinct, and critics who did watch it responded positively. But audience numbers mattered more than praise. The second problem was tone. WKRP was smarter than most sitcoms of the era. Its humor relied on character contradictions, industry satire, and emotional realism. That style confused viewers expecting broader laugh-track comedy. Some episodes were quiet, some were melancholic, some ended without neat moral resolutions. In a decade dominated by easily digestible studio laughs, WKRP asked viewers to listen more carefully than they were used to. Music licensing quietly became another obstacle. Some songs were central to the show's identity, but expensive to clear. This limited rebroadcast potential and hurt its visibility long-term. During its original run, the music felt alive and current, but syndication stripped much of that power away. Viewers discovering the show later often did not understand why it mattered so much at the time. Behind the scenes, morale was constantly under pressure. Cast members knew cancellation was always looming. Writers were forced to fight for creative risks while trying to keep network executives calm. It was a miracle the show lasted as long as it did. WKRP eventually became beloved, but that came years later. In its original broadcast life, it was a nervous gamble that never paid off the way CBS expected. It survived not because it succeeded, but because it refused to collapse immediately. At the time, it was considered a disappointment, a show that should have been massive, but somehow never was. Operation Petticoat looked like a guaranteed success before it even aired. NBC believed they were adapting a proven property. The original film had been popular. Military comedies had a long television history. The late 70s were full of nostalgia-driven programming. Everything pointed toward a comfortable ratings winner. What NBC did not anticipate was how outdated the concept would feel almost immediately. The sitcom followed the crew of a submarine during World War II, mixing military routines with romantic misunderstandings and broad humor. On paper, it sounded harmless. In practice, it felt strangely disconnected from the cultural moment. By the late 70s, audiences were tired of sanitized war stories played for laughs. Vietnam was still a recent wound. Comedy was becoming sharper, more cynical, and more grounded in modern life. Operation Petticoat felt frozen in another decade. The pacing was sluggish. Jokes were predictable. Characters were thin sketches rather than people viewers could invest in. The laugh track worked overtime to sell moments that simply were not landing. Critics noted that the show relied heavily on gimmicks rather than wit. Submarine hijinks replaced genuine character development. Episodes blurred together quickly. Casting also failed to generate excitement. Unlike other military comedies of earlier eras, the ensemble never formed a memorable identity. No breakout character emerged. No chemistry caught fire. The viewers tuned in and tuned out without emotional attachment. Scheduling made things worse. NBC shifted the show around, trying to find a stable audience. That instability signaled weakness. Viewers rarely commit to shows that appear uncertain of their own future. Ratings dipped further, and confidence evaporated. Behind the scenes, there was frustration. Writers struggled to modernize the premise without betraying its nostalgic roots. Executives wanted safe humor, while audiences were clearly moving on. The show was stuck between eras and belonged fully to neither. When cancellation came, it was quiet. No controversy, no protest. Operation Petticoat simply disappeared. It became one of those series networks never rebroadcast and rarely mentioned, a reminder that brand recognition alone cannot carry a sitcom when the cultural mood has shifted. What NBC expected to be comfortable, familiar entertainment instead became an example of how fast television tastes can change. Holmes and Yo-Yo arrived with one of the most aggressively promoted concepts of the decade. ABC believed they had discovered the next big genre-blending breakthrough, a police sitcom paired with science fiction, a tough human detective partnered with a robot cop. This was supposed to be funny, futuristic, and family-friendly all at once. Executives expected it to attract kids, adults, and sci-fi fans who were just discovering Star Wars-style wonder. Instead, it confused nearly everyone. The biggest problem was tone. The show could not decide what it wanted to be. Sometimes it played like a slapstick comedy. Sometimes it leaned into awkward sci-fi ideas. Other times it tried to behave like a straight police procedural. These shifts happened episode to episode and sometimes scene to scene. Viewers never knew what kind of show they were watching. Yo-Yo, the robot partner, was meant to be the hook, but the technology limited what the character could actually do. The robotic movements looked stiff even by 70s standards. Action scenes felt slow and clumsy. Jokes built around malfunctioning circuits wore thin quickly. What sounded clever in pitch meetings felt repetitive on screen. Holmes, the human detective, was written as a straight man, but without depth. He existed mainly to react to the robot, rather than drive stories. This imbalance made episodes feel hollow. Without strong human stakes, the novelty became the entire show. Once that novelty wore off, there was nothing underneath. But critics were harsh. Many pointed out that the show underestimated its audience. The humor relied too heavily on obvious gags, robot mistakes, robot misunderstandings, robot chaos. This had been done before, even in children's programming. For adults tuning in during prime time, it felt juvenile. Scheduling hurt it further. ABC placed the show in a competitive slot, then panicked when ratings did not spike immediately. Episodes were burned off quickly. Promotion slowed. The network quietly gave up. Behind the scenes, the production struggled. Writers found it difficult to craft believable stories around a character who could not move freely. Physical limitations forced rewrites and simplified plots. The robot suit itself was exhausting for the actor inside which limited performance options. Cancellation came fast. In Holmes and Yo-Yo, lasted only a handful of episodes before disappearing. It became a cautionary tale inside the industry, proof that mixing genres does not guarantee success, especially when execution cannot match ambition. What ABC expected to be bold and modern instead felt awkward and unfinished. A sitcom built entirely around a gimmick that collapsed the moment audiences looked past the surface. The Texas Wheelers may be one of the most painful failures of the entire decade because expectations were genuinely high. NBC believed this show had everything needed to become a long-running hit. A loud, eccentric family, a road-based premise, physical comedy, youth appeal. Even future stars were part of the cast. As the network promoted it as a working-class comedy that could capture middle America. Instead, it crashed almost immediately. The premise followed a chaotic Texas family constantly on the move in a run-down truck. The idea was to mix road trip energy with family dysfunction. In theory, this allowed for endless scenarios. New towns, new problems, new jokes every week. In practice, it made the show feel unstable and unfocused. There was no central location for viewers to anchor themselves. No workplace, no neighborhood, no recurring community. Characters appeared and vanished. Supporting roles had no continuity. Audiences could not form attachments because nothing stayed still long enough. The humor leaned heavily into exaggeration. Shouting, slapstick, broad stereotypes. And this style was already starting to fade by the mid-70s as sitcoms moved toward character-driven realism. Compared to shows like MASH or All in the Family, the Texas Wheelers felt old-fashioned even when it debuted. Critics were brutal. Reviews described the show as exhausting rather than funny. Noise replaced wit. Chaos replaced structure. Episodes felt like sketches stretched too long without emotional grounding. Scheduling again played a role. NBC placed the show against stronger competitors, then lost patience quickly. Ratings dropped sharply after the premiere. Executives panicked. Several episodes were pulled or never aired. This created confusion even among viewers who wanted to keep watching. Behind the scenes, morale collapsed. Cast members sensed the lack of confidence from the network, which writers struggled to refine characters that executives had already written off. The show never found its rhythm because it was never given time to breathe. Perhaps the most tragic part is that the Texas Wheelers had potential buried inside it. A mobile sitcom could have worked with sharper writing, clearer emotional focus, but NBC wanted fast laughs and immediate ratings. When those did not appear, the plug was pulled. Today, the show is remembered mostly as trivia, a footnote in the careers of actors who went on to far greater success. But at the time, it represented a major miscalculation, a sitcom the network believed would roar across prime time. Instead, it stalled on the highway and was abandoned almost instantly. Me and the Chimp was announced as a guaranteed crowd pleaser before a single episode aired. CBS believed animals still equaled ratings. The network had decades of proof. Talking horses, clever dogs, mischievous monkeys. Audiences had shown again and again that they would tune in for novelty. This sitcom leaned into that belief completely. The premise was simple. A suburban family ends up living with a chimpanzee that behaves almost like a human child. The chimp causes chaos, misunderstandings, and slapstick disasters while the family reacts. Executives expected wholesome family laughter. What they got instead was discomfort, confusion, and fast audience rejection. The first issue was tone. The show could not decide whether the chimp was an animal or a human stand-in. Sometimes the chimp behaved like a pet, other times like a mischievous child, occasionally like a knowing adult. That inconsistency made the comedy unstable. Viewers did not know how to emotionally process what they were seeing. The second issue was realism. Unlike earlier animal sitcoms, Me and the Chimp placed the animal directly into everyday domestic life. Watching a chimp destroy kitchens, pull pranks, and physically overpower adults was not charming for many viewers. It felt chaotic and unsettling rather than funny. Parents in particular reacted negatively. Production limitations made everything worse. Chimpanzees are unpredictable. Scenes required multiple takes. Writers were forced to simplify scripts around what the animal could realistically perform. This stripped episodes of complexity and pacing. Jokes became repetitive. Chaos became the punchline every time. When critics were merciless, reviews described the show as lazy concept television, a relic of a trend that had already peaked. Many pointed out that the humor relied entirely on the animal rather than writing. Once viewers tired of watching messes being made, there was nothing else to hold attention. Scheduling did not help. CBS burned through episodes quickly. Promotion dropped off sharply. Ratings fell fast and never recovered. The network quietly canceled the show without ceremony. Behind the scenes, there was tension. Cast members struggled to interact naturally with an animal that could not respond consistently. Writers felt boxed in. Executives realized too late that novelty without narrative depth was no longer enough. Me and the Chimp became a turning point, one of the last major animal-centered sitcom experiments of the era. Its failure signaled that audiences were changing. They wanted characters, not gimmicks, stories, not stunts. What CBS expected to be easy laughter became one of the decade's most infamous misfires, a show that arrived with confidence and left behind embarrassment. The New Adventures of Beans Baxter arrived with surprising confidence from CBS. The network believed they had tapped into the youth adventure comedy formula just as teen audiences were becoming more influential in prime time. The premise sounded energetic. A regular high school student secretly works for a government spy agency. Double life, teen awkwardness, espionage chaos. It looked like a blend of sitcom and light action. CBS expected novelty to carry it. Instead, it confused the very audience it was targeting. The first problem was tone instability. Some episodes leaned into slapstick teenage comedy. Other scenes attempted genuine spy parody. The balance never felt natural. One moment the show was mocking espionage cliches. The next, it was delivering them sincerely. I was written as average by design, but was written as average by design. But average does not automatically translate to compelling. His secret agent persona felt underdeveloped. His high school life felt generic. Without a strong central personality, the show relied heavily on situational gimmicks. Production limitations also worked against it. Action sequences were modest. Spy missions felt small-scale. Audiences comparing it to cinematic spy adventures found it underwhelming. The budget did not allow spectacle, yet the premise demanded it. Scheduling hurt momentum early. CBS moved the show within its lineup, which weakened audience retention. Ratings slipped quickly. Yet without strong critical support, the network saw little reason to invest long-term. Behind the scenes, writers struggled to escalate stakes without abandoning the comedic format. Spy stories demand tension. Sitcoms demand reset buttons. The two forces clashed repeatedly. The New Adventures of Beans Baxter lasted only one season and faded rapidly. It remains documented and searchable, yet rarely discussed in retrospectives. CBS anticipated teen engagement and crossover appeal. What they encountered was indifference, a high-concept experiment that never quite justified its ambition. Paul Lynde Show might be the most classic example of a network misunderstanding its own star. ABC believed Paul Lynde was ready to anchor a prime-time hit, but he was already a television personality with strong recognition. Viewers knew his voice, his sarcasm, his timing. Executives assumed that familiarity would translate directly into ratings. They were wrong. The show centered on Lynde as a conservative father navigating generational conflict with his liberal son-in-law. On paper, it seemed like a topical concept. The early 70s were filled with political tension. Networks were chasing the success of socially charged sitcoms, but the Paul Lynde Show lacked the bite that made those hits work. Lynde's persona was sharp, sarcastic, and theatrical. The script softened him into a conventional sitcom dad. That adjustment stripped away the very edge audiences associated with him. Viewers expecting caustic wit found diluted banter instead. The comparisons to All in the Family were immediate and damaging. ABC clearly hoped to capture similar generational friction, but without authentic character conflict, the dynamic felt forced. Arguments resolved too neatly. Tension rarely escalated beyond predictable beats. Critics were quick to point out that the show never fully trusted its own premise. It hinted at cultural commentary, but retreated into safe territory before stakes became real. That hesitation made it feel derivative rather than daring. Ratings started modestly, then declined steadily. ABC attempted minor adjustments, but the structural issues remained. The show lacked identity beyond its star, and even the star felt constrained by format. Behind the scenes, Lynde himself reportedly struggled with the pressure of leading a series. The supporting cast chemistry never fully crystallized. Without ensemble strength, the show leaned too heavily on one personality. Cancellation arrived after a single season. The Paul Lynde Show joined the long list of star vehicles that failed to capture the essence of what made their lead popular. ABC anticipated a breakout success built around name recognition. Instead, they delivered a diluted version of a performer audiences preferred in sharper roles. It stands as a reminder that star power alone cannot compensate for cautious writing. When ABC announced The Harvey Korman Show in 1978, expectations were real and palpable. Harvey Korman was a familiar and beloved television personality with a long and successful track record as a comedy performer. Most audiences knew him from his decade on The Carol Burnett Show, where his comic timing and physical expressiveness made him a standout. The network believed he could carry his own sitcom and bring old and new viewers along with him. They invested in promotion. They placed it in prime time. They leaned into Korman's star energy and looked forward to a ratings boost. What audiences got instead was a lesson in how wrong optimism can be when it is not rooted in strong concept execution. The premise of The Harvey Korman Show was straightforward. Harvey A. Kavanaugh was an ego-driven actor who had never found his defining role, yet was convinced the next big break was right around the corner. He taught an acting class from his own home. His daughter Maggie lived with him and worked at a community bank. Other characters added to the ensemble, including Maggie's boyfriend and a well-meaning agent trying to steer Harvey's career. The idea allowed for workplace comedy family humor and Hollywood ambition all intertwined. But from the very beginning, the show struggled to find a consistent voice. The first challenge was tone. Korman's strength had always been broad comedic reaction and larger-than-life character work. The scripts here tried to soften that persona into a sitcom dad role with occasional Hollywood jokes. The result left the star feeling constrained rather than celebrated. His performance never fully connected with the narrative demands of the series. Instead of building memorable characters, the show asked viewers to accept a series of loosely connected vignettes about auditions, missteps, and rehearsals that never felt funny enough or insightful enough. Critics at the time were kind, but not enthusiastic. Many pointed out that the show lacked sharp writing and memorable scenarios. The humor was gentle, where it needed to be bold. Characters were sketchy rather than lived in. The supporting cast did their best, but without strong material, there was frequently little to react to. Korman himself later expressed disappointment in the series and blamed the writing, which he felt was not up to the cast's potential. Viewers responded with indifference rather than excitement. Ratings did not climb. ABC kept the show alive for 6 episodes, but gave up quickly when it became clear that the series was not building an audience. The cancellation came quietly and without protest. What the Harvey Korman show illustrates vividly is that even established television stars can struggle when placed in concepts that do not allow their natural comedic instincts to flourish. ABC had anticipated familiarity leading to ratings, comfort. Instead, they received a short-lived experiment that vanished nearly as soon as it aired. When Things Were Rotten had everything working in its favor before premiere night. It was created by Mel Brooks. That alone generated excitement. Brooks was already known for sharp parody and bold comedic instincts. ABC believed this medieval Robin Hood satire would attract fans eager for irreverent humor. Anticipation was genuine. The show imagined Robin Hood and his band of outlaws through exaggerated, absurdist comedy. Jokes were fast and occasionally bizarre. The energy was high. ABC expected viewers to embrace the parody style the way they had embraced Brooks films. Television proved to be a different battlefield. The humor that thrived in cinema struggled under network constraints. Television censorship softened some of the sharper edges. Without that edge, the satire felt incomplete. Episodes oscillated between clever and awkward. The pacing sometimes felt rushed, other times oddly stretched. Critics were split. Some admired the attempt at absurdity. Others felt the material did not translate well to weekly episodic format. A parody requires escalation. A sitcom requires sustainability. Balancing both proved difficult. Ratings failed to match expectation. ABC had hoped for a breakout hit. Instead, viewership remained modest and then declined. The show was moved around the schedule. That instability further weakened its chance to build a consistent audience. Behind the scenes, creative tension surfaced. Writing for a parody series week after week required constant invention. The medieval setting limited story variety more than anticipated. Repetition crept in. When cancellation came, it surprised some fans, but not network executives who had already seen the number. The show lasted only 1 season, despite its high-profile creator. When Things Were Rotten is often cited as a cult curiosity rather than a success. It had pedigree, it had promotional energy, it had a recognizable comedic voice, but it could not transform cinematic parody into reliable prime-time momentum. ABC expected prestige and laughter. What they received was a short-lived experiment that proved even celebrated creators are not immune to the harsh arithmetic of ratings. No sitcom on this list arrived with higher expectations than Nanny and the Professor. And ABC believed this show would dominate family television for years. It launched at the very start of the decade and was positioned as a flagship series. Fantasy, family, whimsy, warmth, everything networks thought audiences wanted. The premise centered on a mysterious nanny with magical abilities caring for a widowed professor and his children. It was intentionally gentle, harmless, comforting. ABC saw it as timeless. The problem was that television was changing faster than anyone anticipated. While Nanny and the Professor was still basking in early optimism, the audience was already moving toward sharper, more socially grounded comedy. Within 2 years, All in the Family would explode and redefine sitcom language. Compared to that shift, Nanny and the Professor felt dated almost overnight. The fantasy elements created limitations. Their stories reset too easily. Problems vanished through magic rather than growth. Children learned lessons without consequence. Adults remained static. Over time, this lack of progression drained tension and interest. Critics initially tolerated the show, but enthusiasm faded quickly. Reviews described it as overly sweet, too polite, too safe. The very qualities ABC believed would protect it became liabilities. Ratings slipped steadily. ABC tried to adjust tone, but the premise resisted change. Adding realism broke the fantasy. Leaning further into fantasy felt childish. The show could not evolve with its audience. Behind the scenes, the network slowly lost faith. Promotion decreased. Scheduling shifted. By the time cancellation came, the decision felt inevitable. Nanny and the Professor ran longer than many flops on this list, but that longevity hides the truth. It never became what ABC expected. It never defined the decade. It never shaped the genre. It simply lingered until television moved on without it. Its failure is not about quality alone. It is about timing, being too early, too gentle, too rigid for a medium that was about to undergo a revolution. ABC expected a cornerstone sitcom. Instead, they got a relic almost as soon as it aired. The 70s did not just produce television classics. They produced confidence collapses. These sitcoms were launched with belief money and hype, then rejected almost instantly. They remind us that anticipation means nothing without timing, voice, and truth. Television does not forgive hesitation. It simply moves on.